Episode 17, Nationalism and Industrialization in the 19th Century. Question 1. What three forces combined to shatter the relative calm in Europe? Explain how each contributed to the instability. The cultural shift away from traditional authority that had begun with the Renaissance and with the collapse of feudalism came to a pinnacle during the Enlightenment, which produced a powerful wave of intellectual and socio-economic transformation. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, and Montesquieu challenged the divine right of kings, hereditary privilege, and religious dogma. Reason and individual rights began to replace faith and hierarchy as the foundations of legitimacy. The spread of literacy, print culture, and salons meant that new ideas circulated among the emerging middle class, undermining the old clerical and aristocratic order. This questioning of authority, political, social, and religious, made Europe intellectually dynamic, but also ideologically volatile, setting the stage for revolution. The Enlightenment inspired reform and progress, but it also destabilized belief systems that had held society together for centuries. The commercial revolution, rooted in overseas exploration and colonial expansion, profoundly altered Europe's economy. The rise of global trade networks, plantation economics, and proto industrial manufacturing created immense wealth, but also new tensions. A bourgeois merchant class grew increasingly powerful, challenging the social dominance of the hereditary aristocracy. Inflation, the price revolution, speculative investment, and uneven access to colonial profits exacerbated inequality, while traditional economies based on guilds and feudal rents struggled to adapt. Commercial growth thus fueled both social mobility and resentment. It enriched some, impoverished others, and eroded the stability of the old agrarian order. From roughly 1700 to 1750, Europe's population surged after centuries of stagnation caused by plague, famine, or war. Improved agriculture and public health led to the declining mortality rates. This boom was problematic, as population growth outpaced economic opportunity, especially in rural areas. Overcrowding, rising food prices, land shortages, and underemployment produced massive rural displacement. The resulting wave of migration to towns and cities strained infrastructure, fostered poverty, and created the conditions for social unrest. In effect, population growth intensified every other source of instability by multiplying the number of people competing for limited resources and opportunity. Question 2. What was the long-term impact of the Napoleonic era on the 19th century? The Napoleonic era was characterized by the spread of, and backlash against, revolutionary principles. Napoleon exported the political legacy of the French Revolution across Europe, sometimes by conquest, sometimes by reform. He spread ideas of legal equality, secular government, and meritocracy, later laid out in the Napoleonic Code of 1804, which replaced feudal privileges with rational, centralized legal systems. Monarchies and aristocracies were weakened as nationalism and popular sovereignty gained legitimacy. Even after Napoleon's ultimate defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, European rulers could not entirely undo what he had unleashed. Instead, they sought to contain it. The 1815 Congress of Vienna aimed to turn back the clock, restoring monarchies and rebuilding the pre-revolutionary order. But this restoration coexisted uneasily with the revolutionary ideals that had already taken root. Throughout the 19th century, the tension between conservatism and liberalism, and between monarchism and nationalism, defined European politics, culminating in revolutions in 1830 and 1848, and unification movements in Italy and Germany. Perhaps Napoleon's most enduring legacy was nationalism. He united and organized territories like Italy and Germany under rational, centralized administrations, ironically paving the way for their 19th century unifications. His conquests provoked national resistance movements in Spain, Prussia, and Russia, awakening a sense of shared identity that transcended loyalty to a particular ruling dynasty. The idea that a people, not a monarch, constituted a nation spread widely, fueling both liberation and imperial ambition in the century that followed. Nationalism, born in part from Napoleonic upheaval, would become the dominant political force of the 19th century, reshaping Europe's map and driving colonial expansion abroad. The Napoleonic era left Europe politically transformed by revolutionary ideals and centralized governance, socially modernized by the introduction of progressive Enlightenment ideals, economically accelerated towards industrialization, and ideologically charged with nationalism. Though Napoleon's empire failed, the surviving frameworks and mindsets would define the 19th century and beyond. Question 3. How did the Congress of Vienna result in both external stability and internal disruption? The 1815 Congress of Vienna restored the major powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and France, to a system of balance of power, redrew borders, and created buffer states designed to check French or any one state's dominance. It reinstated monarchies and endorsed the principle of legitimacy, which helped re-establish diplomatic order after the upheaval of the Napoleonic Wars. The creation of the so-called Concert of Europe alliance system meant that the great powers agreed, at least in principle, to cooperate to prevent large-scale continental war. As a result, Europe experienced a relatively peaceful interval, often dated from 1815 to 1848, with no wars between major powers on the scale of the Napoleonic conflicts. However, though borders and monarchies were restored by the Congress of Vienna, it largely ignored the spread of nationalism, liberalism, and popular sovereignty. Many peoples, Italians, Germans, and Poles, for example, were dissatisfied with foreign rule or partitioned lands. It reinforced conservative governance, often restoring absolutist or semi absolutist regimes that suppressed political reform, constitutionalism, and wider suffrage. This created widespread tension throughout Europe. Because many communities were carved up and ruled without regard to ethnic, linguistic, or cultural identities, the settlement fostered resentment and insurgent movements, which would later contribute to revolutions and nationalist unification movements. The Congress succeeded in stabilizing Europe's international order by rebuilding the old aristocratic monarchic system while ensuring no single power dominated. But it did so at the cost of suppressing the internal forces of change, nationalism, liberalism, and calls for popular representation that would accumulate and eventually erupt in the revolutions of 1848. Question 4. Briefly describe the political agendas of the conservative, liberal, and radical factions in mid-19th century Europe. The overarching goal of the conservatives was the preservation of traditional authority and social hierarchy. They favored monarchy, aristocratic privilege, and established religion, especially the Catholic or Protestant state churches. They viewed the revolutions of 1789 and 1848 as dangerous upheavals that threatened stability. Governments should be strong, paternal, and guided by elite wisdom, not popular sovereignty. In short, conservatives sought to restore and preserve the old order, a Europe of kings, nobles, and churchmen. In contrast, liberals favored constitutional government, limited suffrage, and protection of individual rights. They believed in representative institutions, rule of law, and economic freedom grounded in laissez-faire capitalism. They opposed absolutism, but also feared mob rule, so they typically supported restricted voting rights based on property ownership or education. The goal of liberals was a constitutional monarchy or parliamentary system, balancing freedom and social order. In essence, liberals wanted to modernize society without overturning it, empower the middle class while restraining both kings and radicals. Finally, the radicals demanded deep social and political transformation. They championed universal male suffrage, republicanism, and social reform addressing workers' rights, land redistribution, or communal ownership. They drew inspiration from the more egalitarian phase of the French Revolution and from socialist theory. Many were nationalists as well, seeking to unite fragmented peoples, Italians, Germans, Hungarians, under democratic principles. Radicals sought to extend liberty to all classes, not just the bourgeoisie. Conservatives defended the past, liberals managed the present, and radicals imagined a new future, and their clashes defined the political landscape of 19th century Europe. Question 5. What was the key step that marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? Why were the changes that preceded this innovation a necessary foundation for the explosion of innovation prompted by this key step? The steam engine, perfected in the late 18th century by James Watt, transformed the nature of production by providing a reliable, portable, and powerful source of energy, independent of natural forces such as wind and water. Earlier engines, such as Thomas Newcomen's 1712 design, were limited mainly to pumping water out of mines. Watt's crucial improvements in the 1760s to 1770s made steam power efficient, versatile, and adaptable to factories, transportation, and manufacturing. This innovation allowed mechanical energy to be generated anywhere, on demand, breaking centuries of dependence on human, animal, wind, or water power. The steam engine didn't develop in a vacuum. It built on and only became transformative because of earlier developments in agriculture, craftsmanship, and proto industrialization. The agricultural revolution introduced improved farming techniques such as crop rotation, selective breeding, and better tools, and in doing so increased the food supply and freed labor from the countryside. Surplus rural workers became the labor force for new factories. Rising agricultural productivity also produced capital for investment and supported a larger, better fed population, fueling both supply and demand. The steam engine was introduced against a backdrop of commercial and financial expansion. The growth of global trade networks during the 17th and 18th centuries created markets hungry for goods and profits ready for reinvestment. Banking, credit, and joint stock companies provided the financial infrastructure necessary for large-scale industrial ventures. For the steam engine to have had such a profound impact, there necessarily had to be pre-existing technologies ready for steam power. The textile industry in particular had already begun mechanizing through inventions like the spinning jenny and water frame. These innovations demonstrated the potential of machines, but were limited by dependence on water power, which required factories to be built near rivers. The steam engine was the spark that turned gradual mechanical evolution into industrial revolution. But it could only succeed because the necessary conditions existed: agricultural surplus, commercial capital, mechanical experimentation, and a culture of innovation. The steam engine didn't start the modern world by itself, but was a quantum leap forward that greatly accelerated modernization. Question 6. What were the short and long-term consequences of the revolutions of 1848? The revolutions of 1848 were a wave of liberal, nationalist, and socialist uprisings that swept across the continent, from France to Germany, Italy, Austria, and beyond, demanding constitutional government, expanded suffrage, and national self-determination. Though the revolutions were crushed militarily within a year, their long-term consequences were profound. In the immediate aftermath of the failed revolutions, monarchies and conservative regimes quickly regained control. Governments implemented strict censorship, police surveillance, and arrests of reformers. The revolutionary middle class leaders became disillusioned, while the working class bore the brunt of reprisals. The failure deepened divisions between liberals and socialists, weakening cooperation in future reform efforts. Many reformers went into exile, spreading liberal and nationalist ideas abroad, especially to the Americas. The revolutions demonstrated both the power and limitations of mass politics, showing that enthusiasm alone could not overcome entrenched armies and conservative alliances. 1848 ended with the old order apparently restored, but the ideals of 1848 survived and would continue to be a source of political disruption for decades. There was, however, a transformation beneath the surface. The revolutions permanently discredited the concert of Europe and the rigid conservatism of the post Napoleonic settlement. Even victorious monarchs recognized that some reform was necessary to avoid future upheavals. Idealism began to be replaced with realpolitik. Idealistic liberal nationalism gave way to pragmatic state directed nationalism. Cavour in Italy and Bismarck in Germany are the best examples of this. Later national unifications, Italy in 1861, Germany in 1871, fulfilled the aspirations of 1848, but from the top down, not from revolutionary crowds. Many monarchies cautiously adapted reforms once considered radical: constitutional governments, parliaments, and expanded suffrage. Industrialization and urbanization accelerated, creating the social basis for more enduring democratic movements. The revolution spread the idea that legitimacy must rest on popular consent and national identity, not dynastic inheritance. They also highlighted the social question: poverty, labor rights, and class inequality, which would dominate late 19th century politics. In the short term, the revolutions failed. Conservative monarchs triumphed, and reformers were silenced or exiled. In the long term, however, the revolutions succeeded indirectly. They destroyed the credibility of absolutism, inspired gradual reform, and set the stage for national unification and the spread of liberal democracy. Question 7. Why does nationalism inherently bolster conservatism? From the early 19th century, nationalism was a revolutionary force. It challenged the dynastic, multi ethnic empires of Europe, the Habsburg, Ottoman, Russian, by asserting that the people, not the monarch, are the true basis of sovereignty. However, once national unification had been achieved, nationalism shifted its character. Newly created states needed stability and loyalty, not rebellion. National identity became the vehicle of legitimacy for those in power. The language of nationalism, duty, unity, heritage, and defense of the homeland, fit easily with conservative notions of hierarchy, tradition, and obedience to authority. The same emotional current that had once destroyed the old order was now harnessed to defend the new one. Conservatism, at its core, values continuity, social cohesion, and loyalty to the community over individual freedom or radical change. Nationalism complements this by presenting the state as a timeless, almost sacred entity to which all citizens owe allegiance. It frames the world as one of insiders and outsiders, reinforcing the conservative emphasis on social unity, hierarchy, and exclusion of the quote unquote other. And nationalism presents deference to authority as patriotism. Obeying the monarch becomes synonymous with serving the nation. Nationalism binds citizens emotionally to existing institutions, transforming obedience into virtue and dissent into betrayal. Nationalism bolsters conservatism because both exalt unity, tradition, and loyalty over individual dissent. Once the nation state is achieved, nationalism shifts from a force of liberation to a force of preservation, turning patriotism into the most effective shield of authority. Question 8. Explain the role of nationalism in the 19th century unifications of Germany and Italy. How does this differ from previous wars of expansion and unification? The unifications of Germany and Italy in the 19th century were driven by nationalist ideology, but carried out through pragmatic, state centered realpolitik. This marked a major departure from earlier wars of conquest or dynastic expansion, which were about rulers extending their power, not peoples uniting around a shared national identity. The unification of Italy, Il Risorgimento, came first. Before 1850, Italy was divided into a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and foreign controlled territories. The idea of a unified Italian nation had been inspired by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, but was merely a romantic fantasy until the mid 19th century. Giuseppe Mazzini, founder of Young Italy, embodied the romantic nationalist vision that Italy was a natural, cultural, and historical community destined for liberty and unity. His message of Dio e popolo, God and the people, inspired a patriotic but ultimately doomed series of uprisings between 1830 and 1848. The turning point came when Count Camillo di Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont Sardinia, combined nationalism with realpolitik. Cavour wanted to unite Italy, and he believed that diplomacy, limited war, and plebiscites were preferable over all out revolution. His measured approach was a success, unifying much of the north of the country under the authority of the Piedmontese king, Victor Emmanuel II. When Giuseppe Garibaldi and his nationalist volunteers known as the Red Shirts conquered the south of Italy, they then yielded authority to Victor Emmanuel, finally creating a unified kingdom of Italy. In the case of Italian unification, nationalism supplied the emotional and ideological drive, but unification succeeded only when channeled by conservative, pragmatic leadership. Italy was unified from above, but in the name of the nation, not the dynasty. Germany was even more fragmented than had been Italy. There were about 39 states in the German Confederation after the Congress of Vienna. Early German nationalism emphasized a shared language, culture, and destiny. An 1848 attempt to unite Germany under a liberal constitution failed. Liberal nationalism was too idealistic and lacked legitimacy. Enter Otto von Bismarck, the conservative chancellor of Prussia. He had successfully harnessed nationalism to strengthen Prussian power, not to advance liberal democracy. Through a series of wars between 1864 and 1871, Bismarck achieved German unification under Prussian leadership. The German Empire was proclaimed in 1871 at Versailles, an extraordinary symbolic reversal of French dominance. The unifications of Germany and Italy were nationalist revolutions achieved by conservative statesmen. Unlike earlier wars of conquest, they were fought not to expand dynastic power, but to embody a shared national identity, even as that identity was carefully shaped and controlled from above. Question 9. Describe Karl Marx's socialist theory. Karl Marx's socialist theory, developed in the 19th century in collaboration with Friedrich Engels, sought to explain the dynamics of history, economics, and social power through what he called historical realism, the idea that material, economic conditions, rather than ideas or morals, are the driving force behind human development. At the heart of Marx's theory is the concept of class struggle. Throughout history, societies have been divided into classes defined by their relationship to the means of production: those who own, the ruling class, and those who labor, the oppressed. In capitalist society, this takes the form of the bourgeoisie, owners of factories, capital, and land, exploiting the proletariat, wage laborers who sell their work to survive. This exploitation, Marx argued, is inherent in capitalism because workers produce more value than they are paid for. The difference, or surplus value, becomes profit for the capitalist. Marx believed that capitalism, while historically progressive in developing technology and productivity, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. As competition drives down wages and concentrates wealth, the working class becomes increasingly impoverished and alienated, not only from the products of their own labor, but also from their own humanity. This alienation leads to a growing awareness, or class consciousness, that would ultimately unite workers in revolution. In Marx's vision, this revolution would overthrow the capitalist system and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional phase in which the working class would abolish private ownership and would ensure that the means of production is organized for human need rather than profit. In essence, Marx's socialism was both a critique of capitalism and a scientific theory of historical change, predicting that economic forces and class struggle would inevitably produce a more equitable social order. Question 10. Why would mass leisure culture be a natural consequence of the socio-economic trends of the Industrial Revolution? Mass leisure culture emerged naturally from the social and economic transformations of the Industrial Revolution because industrialization fundamentally changed how people worked, lived, and spent their time. Before industrialization, leisure was limited, informal, and tied to the rhythms of agricultural life. Work and rest blended together according to the seasons, and recreation was largely local and communal. The rise of industrial capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries replaced this with regulated wage labor, urban living, and a structured division between work and non work hours. As the working day became fixed and the weekend gradually institutionalized, a new collective sense of free time emerged. At first, the working class had little disposable income or time to enjoy it. But as wages rose modestly, working hours shortened, and living standards improved, especially by the late 19th century, leisure became a mass phenomenon rather than a privilege of the elite. Industrialization also created the means for leisure itself. Railways and steamships made travel for pleasure accessible to ordinary people. Urbanization concentrated population in cities, supporting theaters, public parks, etc. Mass production lowered the cost of consumer goods. Bicycles are a good example, creating shared experiences and interests. Cultural entrepreneurs and industrialists quickly recognized the economic potential of leisure. Sports, cinema, amusement parks, and organized holidays became commercialized extensions of the industrial economy. The same forces that standardized work, mechanization, scheduling, and efficiency, also standardized entertainment, producing a leisure industry designed for mass consumption. In essence, the Industrial Revolution's legacy of urbanization, higher real wages, transportation networks, and mass production didn't just revolutionize labor, it invented modern leisure, turning recreation into a defining feature of an industrialized society.